My name is Mara Lindqvist. Welcome to Heartbreak Diaries Official.
The heat in Black Hills, Dakota Territory, in the August of 1883 was not just heat. It was a living, breathing cruelty. It pressed down on the unpaved streets of the little town of Redemption like a blacksmith's hand on hot iron, beating the dust into a pail, choking powder that settled on windowsills and eyelashes and the insides of lungs. It settled on everything, like grief, like loss, like the particular kind of silence that follows a coffin being lowered into the ground. And before I go any further, if this story finds you today, wherever you are in this world, please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Because this story, this small, quiet story from a forgotten Dakota winter, deserves to travel far. It deserves to reach every person who has ever been told that their idea is foolish, that their grief has made them mad, that the hole they are standing in is their grave and not their doorway. So stay with me. Please, stay with me till the end. For the townspeople of Redemption, the August heat was a temporary torment, a final siege before the mercy of autumn arrived with its golden light and cooling winds. They bore it with the comfortable grumbling of people who know that relief is coming. For Mara Lindqvist, the heat was a clock. Every shimmering wave rising from the parched, cracked earth was another tick. Another second passing in a life she could not yet see clearly, but deeply, terribly feared. She was 29 years old. She had strong hands and a quiet way of speaking and eyes the color of a northern sea on a cloudy day, gray and deep and full of something ancient. She was a widow. That word, widow, it sat on her like the humid August air itself, heavy and unwanted and inescapable. A garment she had never chosen. A garment she could not take off no matter how many times she reached for the collar to pull it free. Her husband, Jonas, had been a well digger. Say that simply and you miss the fullness of it. Jonas Lindqvist had not merely been a man who dug holes for water. He had been the last son in a long, long line of Danish men who had worked underground, not just for water, but for stone and coal and the deep secrets of the earth. His grandfather had worked the mines of Jutland. His father had taught him the language of soil and shale and limestone before Jonas had learned to read a single word on a page. He carried the earth in his blood the way other men carry music in their bones or numbers behind their eyes. He had come to this raw, unfinished Dakota land with a dream that felt, to him, as solid and certain as bedrock. Water, he had told Mara on the ship crossing the Atlantic, his big warm hands wrapped around hers, the ocean gray and vast around them. Water is the lifeblood of any settlement. These frontier towns, they're all desperate for it. A man who can find it, who truly understands the deep earth the way I do. Mara, we will not just survive out there. We will thrive. She had believed him. How could she not? When Jonas spoke of the earth, his whole face changed. His eyes went soft and focused at the same time, the way a musician's eyes go when they hear a melody that moves them. He was not a boastful man. He was simply a man who knew his gift. He had bought a small plot just outside the town of Redemption for nearly nothing. A scrabble of rock and thin, exhausted grass that nobody else wanted, sitting on land that the older settlers called hardpan and dismissed with a wave of the hand. Jonas had looked at it the way a sculptor looks at a rough block of marble. He had smiled his quiet smile. He had begun to dig. He was looking for water. He found only his grave. A sudden collapse. That is what they told her at the door of their small rented room in town, their hats in their hands and their faces arranged in the particular expression of men delivering news they do not want to deliver. A sudden collapse. The earth had given way without warning. A torrent of dry soil and broken shale. Jonas, the man who had listened to the deep ground his entire life, had been silenced by it. Silence forever. He left her with the land. He left her with a half-finished shack that was less a house than a collection of tired boards leaning against each other for comfort, arguing with every gust of wind that came down from the hills. And he left her with the well, his monument, his inheritance to her, a perfectly circular shaft, beautifully engineered, its walls shored with expert timber framing, dropping 40 feet straight down into the unyielding Dakota bedrock. It was bone dry, not a trace of moisture, not a whisper of an underground stream. A testament, the town quietly agreed, to a failed gamble on impossible land. The town pitied her, of course. Pity was the first language of redemption. A woman alone, a foreigner with a quiet tongue and a slight accent that marked her as other, left with nothing but a dry well and a shack and a plot of worthless hardpan. Their pity arrived like casseroles and condolences, warm for a moment and then gone cold. Mr. Silas. No, let me give him his name in this story. His name was Edmund Voss. Edmund Voss was the town's preeminent builder and the owner of the lumber mill, a large man made larger by decades of other people's deference to his opinions. His voice carried the authority of someone who has been right so many times that he has forgotten what it feels like to be wrong. He made his assessment of Mara's situation with the brisk, compassionate efficiency of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. That shack won't survive a real blizzard, he said, standing at the edge of her property with his thumbs in his belt loops and his eyes moving over everything she owned with that particular look of a man calculating worth. And the land is useless. Nothing but a dry well and hardpan. She'll need to find a family to take her in before first snow, or it'll be the church providing. He was not wrong about the shack, but about the well, about the land, about Mara Lindqvist herself. He was wrong in the deepest, most fundamental way a confident person can be wrong. He saw a failure. Mara saw a doorway, because Jonas had not only been a well digger. In the evenings, in their small rented cot, he had not told her stories of saints and kings. He had told her stories of geology, of thermal gradients, of the way the deep earth held its breath, maintaining a steady, constant temperature, utterly indifferent to the raging fevers of summer or the killing cold of winter. The surface world is a frantic child, he used to say, his hands tracing slow patterns on the rough blanket between them, his voice low and peaceful, the voice of a man sharing something sacred. It screams with heat in summer. It shrieks with cold in winter. It cannot decide. It cannot be still. But you go down just a little way, Mara, just past the frost line. And the earth remembers a time before seasons. It keeps a steady heart. She had listened. Every single time. She had listened the way you listen to someone you love when you know, somewhere quietly inside yourself, that their words are building something in you that will matter later. She had not known how much later it would matter. She had not known that his voice, still and patient in her memory, would one day save her life. One sweltering afternoon, while the town retreated to the shade of its porches and the cool interior of its saloon, Mara walked alone to the edge of the well at the far end of her property. She stood there for a long time, looking down. The well was a perfect circle of darkness below her feet. 40 feet of careful, expert work. The timbers Jonas had placed along the walls were strong and precise. Even in dying, he had done his work with mastery. She took a breath. The air rising from the darkness was not the air of something dead and forgotten. It was cool. It was clean. It smelled of stone and deep earth, and something ancient and patient that had been waiting underground since long before any human being had ever set foot on this prairie. It did not smell like a grave. It smelled like a promise. And Mara Lindqvist stood at the edge of her husband's last, unfinished work, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not the sharp crack of breaking. Something else. Something quieter. Like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. She did not make her decision in desperation. She did not make it in madness, as the town would later claim. She made it with the same deliberate, clear-eyed logic that Jonas had used when he looked at a piece of worthless land and saw water. She would not fight the winter. She would step aside and let it pass over her. She tied the rope to the sturdy, windlass Jonas had built before his death, lit her lantern with steady hands, and climbed down. The heat of the August sun vanished 10 feet below the rim. At 20 feet, the air was cool and perfectly still, like the interior of a church on a weekday. At the bottom of the shaft, 40 feet down in the belly of the Dakota bedrock, it was the temperature of a root cellar in late autumn. A deep, profound, settled coolness that felt not like the absence of heat, but like the presence of something. Some ancient, unwavering calm. Mara held the lantern high with one hand and pressed the other flat against the wall. The rock was cool and solid beneath her palm. Strong, patient, indifferent to the suffering of the surface world in the most comforting way imaginable. She closed her eyes. In the perfect silence 40 feet below the earth, she listened. She heard nothing but the faint, steady beat of her own heart. And in that silence, she did not feel alone. She felt the immense, quiet presence of the earth itself surrounding her. Not crushing, holding. She was not in a hole. She was in a sanctuary. When she climbed back out, blinking hard against the aggressive blaze of the afternoon sun, everything was different. Nothing had changed. The shack still argued with the wind. The drywall was still dry. The town's pity still hung in the air like the dust. But Mara Lindqvist had a plan. She would not be a liability. She would not beg for charity. She would finish the work Jonas had started, not by going deeper, but by going wider. She would not build on top of the earth and dare the winter to knock it down. She would build inside the earth, and she would be warm. She had no idea, standing there in the August heat with dirt on her dress and the ghost of Jonas's voice in her ears, that what she was about to build would change every single life in that town. She had no idea that the thing they were all calling her folly would one day be called her gift. Stay with me, because what happens next is where this story truly begins. The town watched her the way people watch something they cannot quite categorize. With curiosity first, the harmless, head-tilting curiosity of people who expect a minor spectacle and then a return to normalcy. Then with bewilderment. Then with something that started as concern and curdled, as it so often does among people who have decided they know better, into mockery. Because Mara was not doing what a sensible grieving widow should do. She was not reinforcing the shack. She was not stacking firewood or seeking employment at the mercantile or attaching herself to a family that might shelter her through the winter. She was hauling buckets of dirt out of the well, day after day after day. The pile of excavated earth beside the wellhead grew slowly, steadily, inexorably. It grew the way Mara's resolve grew, without announcement, without drama, one careful load at a time. The children named it first, as children always do. They watched from the road, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes wide with the particular bright cruelty of children who have learned their cruelty from the adults around them. The widow's folly, they called it. The name spread through redemption the way all good gossip spreads, quickly and completely, attaching itself to every conversation about Mara Lindqvist until it was less a nickname and more an identity. Adults adopted it with the slow, sad headshake of people who have already written you off. Grief does strange things to a person, they said over their coffee and their card games. Poor woman digging her own grave. Mara ignored them. This is the part that is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. Not engineering, not the vision, the ignoring. Most of us, when we're mocked by an entire community, when the verdict has been delivered and our name has become a punchline, we waver. We second-guess. We spend whole nights lying awake wondering if they are right, if we're the foolish ones, if our certainty is just another form of madness. Mara did not waver. Her world narrowed, with a focus that might look from the outside like obsession, but was in fact simply purpose, to the weight of the shovel in her hands, the smell of the deep earth, the rhythm of her own breathing, the slow, honest pain in her shoulders at the end of the day's work. She was not digging wildly. She was not tearing at the earth in grief-fueled desperation. She was excavating with the careful precision Jonas had taught her, reading the stone the way he had taught her to read it, following the seams, bracing the ceiling as she went with the same expert timber framing that had lined the original shaft. At the bottom of the 40-foot well, she began to tunnel horizontally, heading north, away from the path of the winter sun. She planned it all on paper first, by lantern light in the cold of the evening, her hands still raw from the day's work. A main living chamber, 12 feet by 16. A sleeping alcove. A pantry where the steady, unwavering cool of the deep earth would keep her provisions through the longest winter. Each design decision is born not of whimsy, but of logic, of the things Jonas had told her, of the things she had listened to and stored and was now at last spending. Every bucket of rock and soil she sent up the hand-cranked windlass was a small, private victory. Every yard of horizontal tunnel was another yard further from the life the town had already written for her. She was not just building a shelter. She was building the life she intended to live. And the town had no idea. They looked at the growing mound of earth and saw evidence of madness. They could not see what was happening 40 feet below their feet. They could not see the chambers taking shape in the living rock. They could not hear the quiet, steady sound of a woman who had decided, with every fiber of her being, that she was not finished. The confrontation she had known was coming arrived on a bright September afternoon, the aspens in the far hills just beginning to turn their brilliant, heartbreaking yellow. A beautiful warning, the kind of beauty that carries cold in its colors. Edmund Voss rode out to her property on his good gray horse, picking his way around the mound of excavated earth with the careful disdain of a man visiting a place he has already condemned. He was a large man, Edmund Voss, made larger by his reputation and his certainty. He dismounted at the edge of the well with the deliberate, unhurried movements of a man who expected his arrival to matter. He stood there for a moment, looking at the hole, looking at the mound of dirt, looking at the pitiful shack with its arguing boards and its losing battle with the wind. Then Mara emerged from the shaft. She came up the ladder with her face smudged with the pale dust of broken shale, and her hands raw and red, and her hair tied back under a kerchief. She looked to Edmund Voss's eyes like a woman in the middle of destroying herself, like something difficult to witness. He composed his face into the expression of stern, paternalistic concern that was his preferred emotional register when dealing with women whose decisions he disapproved of. "Mistress Lindqvist," he began. Mara stood at the rim of the well, her shovel in her hand, and simply looked at him, waiting. "This has gone on long enough," he continued, with the tone of a man who is doing you a kindness by telling you a hard truth. "Winter is 2 months away. Your shack is falling apart. You have no cordwood to speak of. You're spending your strength on this hole. The town is worried. I am worried. What is your plan, woman?" "My plan," Mara said, and her voice was quiet and level and completely unrattled, "is here." She patted the ground beside the well with one raw, dirty hand. Voss let out the long, exasperated sigh of a man whose patience is being tested beyond reasonable limits. "You cannot live in a well, Mistress Lindqvist. It is a tomb. The first heavy rain will flood you out. It will collapse on you. It will be damp and dark, and you'll be buried alive. I will not have that on my conscience. I know these things. I am a builder. I know our winters. This is not courage. This is madness." "You know the surface, Mr. Voss," Mara replied, her gray eyes steady on his face. "You build boxes that sit on the skin of the earth and dare the wind to knock them down. You fight the cold with fire." He stiffened. "And what is wrong with that?" "Nothing is wrong with it. It is brave. It is how everyone does it." A small silence. "I do not intend to fight it," she said. Voss stared at her. "Then what in God's name do you intend?" "To be where it is not," she said simply. That simplicity, the absolute, unadorned simplicity of it, seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. He had no rebuttal for something so direct. His mind went searching for the counter-argument and found only the rough wall of her certainty. "You are digging your own grave," he said at last, and his voice dropped into something low and warning and final. "You are a danger to yourself, and when you freeze or starve or are buried alive in that hole, it will be this town that deals with the consequences. It will be in our hands, and I will not, Mistress Lindqvist, allow you to put that weight on this community." The threat inside the concern, the control dressed up as care. Mara had heard this language before. She knew it. She understood what was really being said. She looked at his fine leather boots, his confident posture, his hands on his hips, the stance of a man accustomed to being the last word on any subject. He saw a hole, a void, a negative space, a problem. He could not see what it possessed. "Mr. Voss," she said softly, "you're only reading one side of the ledger." He blinked. "I'm not digging a grave," she said. "I am building a root cellar for human being." Edmund Voss stared at her for a long, long moment, searching her face for the crack in her certainty, for the flicker that would tell him she was not serious, or that her seriousness was the seriousness of someone who has broken a little and doesn't know it yet. He found nothing. He shook his head with the slow, heavy movement of a man washing his hands of a situation, mounted his horse, rode away without another word. Mara watched him go. Then she turned back to the well. She picked up her shovel. She climbed down. If you have ever had someone look at your dream and call a grave, if you have ever had your quiet certainty met with someone else's loud authority, then you already know exactly how Mara Lindqvist felt in that moment. But what came next, what she built in the weeks that followed, what the earth gave her in return for her trust and her labor, that is the part that will stay with you. Don't go anywhere. Where are you listening from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you know someone who is building something that other people are calling foolish, share this with them. They need to hear what happens next. October came to the Dakota Hills like a painter who has decided, for one last brilliant week, to spend everything in the palette before the gray arrives. The aspens blazed yellow. The oaks went rust and amber. The sky, between the brilliant trees and the brilliant cold stars, was a blue so deep it ached. And 40 feet below it all, in the quiet heart of the earth, Mara Lindqvist was completing something extraordinary. It was not a cave. Please understand that. What she had excavated over weeks of careful, methodical, bone-deep work was not a cave. It was not a damp, dripping hole in the ground where a desperate woman had retreated from a world that had beaten her. It was a home. The main chamber was 12 feet by 16 feet, with a ceiling arched in the natural curve of the shale she had followed, high enough for Mara to stand comfortably and move freely. The walls were the living rock itself, cool and solid and honest, smooth where her tools had touched them, and left in their natural texture where they had not. The sleeping alcove branched off one side of the main room, just wide enough for her cot and the small cedar chest she had brought from Denmark, carved with the initials of Jonas's mother. On the other side, the pantry, a cool, dark pocket in the deep earth where her potatoes and carrots and salted meat and dried herbs would keep through the longest winter at a temperature that never wavered, never froze, never rotted. The floor was packed earth, swept smooth, covered with the few rugs she owned. The walls were the stone of the ages. And through the main shaft above, her lantern light fell warm and amber and soft. It was more peaceful than any room she had ever lived in. But Mara knew that shelter is not merely a roof and walls. Jonas had taught her this too, in those quiet evenings with his hands tracing patterns in the dark. A mind without airflow, he had told her, is a tomb, not because of the cold or the dark, because of the air. The air has to move. A living space has to breathe. This was the piece of the design that nobody else could see, not from the outside, not from the road where the townsfolk shook their heads at the mound of dirt and the sagging shack, not from the comfortable certainty of Edmund Voss. She needed to give her home alone. She spent a week, her most difficult and loneliest week, on a small rocky rise about a quarter-mile from the well, at a point she had carefully measured to sit approximately 30 feet higher in elevation than her main chamber. There, on that empty, wind-scoured hillock, she dug a second shaft, much smaller than the well, only 2 feet across, narrow as a chimney. She lined it with carefully fitted stones, each one chosen and placed with the patience of someone who understands that the details that look like nothing are often the details that matter most. To anyone passing by, it looked like nothing at all, a small, stone-lined pit on an empty hill. Then came the final act of Jonas's education, the most physically demanding, most claustrophobic, most extraordinary piece of her entire construction. From the back of her main, living chamber, she began to tunnel again. Not wide, not tall, just large enough for her body, for her arms to swing a small pick, for a little wooden cart she had built to carry the excavated material back out. She was tunneling toward the chimney shaft on the hill. 40 feet of horizontal tunnel through solid shale, guided by a compass Jonas had given her on their first anniversary, guided by the innate, inherited sense of direction of a family that had worked underground for 3 generations. She worked alone. She worked in the dark and the tight, enclosed silence, with nothing but the sound of her own pick and her own breathing and the distant, muffled world above. There were hours in the middle of that tunnel where the weight of the earth above her felt immense, where the thought of Jonas, silenced by a collapse not so different from the one she was risking every day, pressed against her chest, where the grief that she had been outrunning with her labor caught her for a moment and held her still. In those moments, she pressed her cheek against the cool stone wall. "Jonas," she whispered, not a prayer exactly, more like a coordinate, a way of finding north. And then she kept digging. The day her pick broke through into the base of the chimney shaft was the quietest triumph she had ever experienced. No one saw it. No one knew. Just Mara, alone in a narrow tunnel 40 feet underground, with a column of cool, clean, impossibly sweet air rushing past her face from the world above, like a deep, long sigh of relief. She closed her eyes, and she let herself cry. Not from sadness, from something else. The particular release of a person who has been holding everything together for a very long time and has, at last, found solid ground. Now the system was complete. Now let me explain to you, the way Jonas explained to Mara, the beautiful, elegant physics of what she had built. Because this is where her genius lives, not in brute labor, but in understanding. The main well shaft, her entrance, sat at a lower elevation than the ventilation chimney on the hill above. The air inside her home, warmed by her body and her lantern and eventually a small stove, would rise. Warm air rises. It has done this since the beginning of time. As that warmer, lighter air rose and was pushed gently out through the higher ventilation shaft on the hillock, it created a gentle, constant suction behind it. That suction pulled fresh, cool air down the main well entrance. An endless, self-perpetuating loop. A convective current. Her home would breathe on its own, constantly, steadily, without any mechanical assistance whatsoever. Without a single howling draft. It was breathtaking in its simplicity, and it was the exact opposite of everything Edmund Voss had ever built. Because Voss's houses, his beautiful, solid, expertly crafted log cabins, were fighting a war they could not win. There were boxes built to contain warmth, but every fire they lit was eating the air inside the box and pulling in replacements from every crack and crevice in the walls. The hearth that was meant to save them was, in a very real sense, working against them, sucking frozen drafts across the floor while its heat shot straight up the chimney into the sky. A roaring fire with its back to a frozen room. The family huddled in a small circle of orange light while their backs froze and their woodpile shrank with terrifying speed. They were trying to heat a box designed to leak. They were fighting the cold with everything they had, and the cold, patient and vast and indifferent, was winning. Mara's home was not fighting anything. The earth surrounding her chambers was not just rock and soil. It was 40 feet of the greatest natural insulator in the world. For 6 months, all summer long, that enormous mass of earth had been slowly, quietly absorbing the warmth of the sun. A thermal battery charging over months, storing energy with a patience that no furnace could match. Now, as the surface world cooled toward winter, that stored warmth would slowly, imperceptibly radiate back into her living space. The cold at the surface would take months to penetrate even a few feet into the ground. Her chambers, at 40 feet, were beyond its reach. The ground temperature 40 feet down would hold, steady as a heartbeat, at approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In the depths of winter, in a blizzard, in 40 below, 50 degrees, without a single log of firewood. She installed the small cast iron stove Jonas had bought in their first months here, the one she had kept despite having nowhere logical to put it, as if some part of her had known she would need it eventually. But the stovepipe was not a conventional stovepipe. It did not exit vertically through a ceiling into the sky, bleeding heat into the cold air above. Instead, it snaked horizontally, descending into a long trench she had dug beneath the floor, running for 40 feet through a channel lined with flat stones and packed earth, before connecting at its far end to the base of her ventilation chimney. This was the last inheritance, the trick that Jonas had called making the smoke pay rent. The hot gases from her small cooking fire would travel the entire length of that underground flue. As they traveled, they surrendered their heat to the stone lining and the packed earth around them. By the time the smoke reached the chimney exit and rose into the cold Dakota air, it was barely warm. It had given everything, and everything it had given was now radiating gently and steadily up through the floor of her home. Her floor was a radiator. A single small fire, lit to cook the evening's meal, would warm her chamber for hours after the flame had gone cold. Her woodpile, the pile that Edmund Voss had looked at with such transparent pity in September, was more than sufficient. More than enough. Laughably, embarrassingly more than enough. She had not built a hole in the ground. She had built a machine for living, and the machine was perfect. The town thought they were watching a woman fall apart. They had no idea they were watching a woman build something that none of them had ever imagined. They had no idea what November was about to prove. And Edmund Voss had absolutely no idea that the moment that would break him open and change him forever was coming. Coming soon. Stay right here. If this story is moving you, if it is speaking to something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me what it's touching. Tell me what it reminds you of. And please share this story. Someone in your life needs to hear it right now. I know they do. November came softly. It always does in those Dakota hills. Light flurries, beautiful and gentle, powdering the fields and the rooftops in a thin white dusting that melted by midday and left everything washed and clean. The townspeople of Redemption looked at Mara's sagging, half-collapsed shack, at the strange mound of earth beside it, at the thin and barely visible wisp that occasionally rose from a stone-lined pipe on the far hillock, and they shook their heads with the satisfied sadness of people whose worst predictions are about to be confirmed. The reckoning was near. December came. The first real blizzard of the season struck in the second week, a solid 2-day storm that dropped a foot of snow and sent the temperature down hard and fast. The town hunkered behind its log walls and fed its fires and emerged, cold but intact, with the pleased, vindicated energy of people who have just proven their own toughness. They had built well. They had stacked their cordwood deep. They had survived the first test. Edmund Voss, meeting a neighbor at the mercantile in the storm's aftermath, was heard to say, in the comfortable, expansive tone of a man warming himself beside his own certainty, "I wonder if the mole woman has frozen yet. We may need to form a digging party come spring." A little laughter, a little head-shaking, a little of that particular sadness that people feel when they are secretly relieved it is someone else. But that was not the test. That was merely the rehearsal. The real thing arrived on the 3rd day of January, 1884. It did not come like a storm. It came like a judgment. The morning of January 3rd was bright and brutally, misleadingly clear. A sky so blue it looked painted, hard-edged clouds sitting still on the western horizon. The air so cold and dry it crackled with each breath. The older settlers, the ones who had been on this land long enough to read it, went quiet that morning. They looked at the sky with eyes that held something beyond weather reading, something that looked like the particular attention of people who have survived something they will never quite forget. By noon, the sky in the west had turned the color of a graphite slate. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the temperature, which had been a painful 15 below zero, dropped another 20 degrees in less than an hour. The wind began as a whisper. It rose to a moan, then to a howl, then to something beyond howling, something that did not have a word in the ordinary vocabulary of weather, a sound that was less like wind and more like the world itself deciding to come apart at the seams. The snow did not fall. It flew, horizontal, dense, blinding, driven by winds that turned every exposed surface into a white, roaring chaos. A man who stepped outside could not see his own hand in front of his face. The world contracted to a sphere of white fury about 3 feet in diameter, and everything beyond that sphere ceased to exist. Men who knew this land intimately, who had walked its paths 10,000 times, became lost between their front door and their barn. Some of them did not find their way back. The temperature fell to 20 below zero, then 30, then 40, and the wind took that number and multiplied it into something the human body was not designed to survive. A cold that did not bite. A cold that I consumed. A cold that makes the bones of your face ache and your breath come out as solid ice crystals and the tears freeze on your cheeks before they reach your chin. For 3 days and 3 nights, the white hurricane raged. Inside Edmund Voss's house, the one he had built for his own family as a showpiece of his craft, the finest house in Redemption by any objective measure. The battle was desperate and growing more desperate by the hour. His wife, Clara, and their 2 children were pressed together around the great stone fireplace, wrapped in every blanket, every coat, every piece of fabric that the house contained. The fire roared. It consumed logs at a rate that made Voss's stomach clench every time he looked at the dwindling woodpile outside. He could not stop feeding it. Without the fire, the room would become a tomb within the hour. He knew this with absolute certainty. But the fire's heat seemed to reach only a small circle. 2 feet, 3 feet. Beyond that, the cold held dominion as absolute and unanswerable as anything Voss had ever encountered. Frost was forming on the interior walls, creeping along the gaps between the logs in cruel, intricate patterns, a map of every place his workmanship had failed. A cup of water on the kitchen table, not 5 feet from the roaring fire, had frozen solid. The windows were opaque sheets of white. Every blast of wind was a physical assault on the house, forcing needles of frozen air through microscopic cracks, through gaps he had stuffed with rags, and then stuffed again, and then stuffed a 3rd time. He was the best builder in the territory, and he was losing. He was losing to the cold the way a man loses a fight to an opponent who is simply, fundamentally too large, who cannot be hurt, who does not tire. He looked at his children's faces. His daughter, 7 years old, had stopped crying and gone quiet in the way that frightened him more than the crying had. His son, 10, was pretending to be brave, doing it well, but Voss could see the fear behind the performance, and it broke something in him that he had not known was breakable. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at the frost on the inside of his walls. He looked at his own hands, the strong, skilled, capable hands of the best builder in the territory, and he felt the cold inside them, not just on the skin, deep, in the joints. And for the first time in his adult life, Edmund Voss was afraid. He was not afraid of death in the abstract. He was afraid of failing his family in the most specific, concrete, immediate way possible. He was afraid that his house, his masterpiece, his proudest work, was not enough, was not good enough, was built on a foundation of assumptions that this storm was dismantling, nail by nail. Throughout the town, the story was the same and worse. Families abandoned the cold rooms of their houses and crowded together in the single room with the fireplace, abandoning the rest of their homes to the inhuman cold. Livestock died in barns that were little better than windbreaks, freezing where they stood. The sound of the wind was a constant, maddening presence that never stopped and never softened and never offered any reassurance that it would ever end. They were tough people. They were pioneers, self-selected for hardship. They had come to this land knowing it was not easy, and they had stayed through hard seasons and hard losses, and they had built their town with their own hands. But this was different. This was a force that made the assumptions of a lifetime feel thin as paper. Their thick log walls and their roaring fires were proving to be a tragic illusion. They were not masters of this land. In this moment, frozen and terrified and burning through their woodpiles at a rate that could not be sustained, they were its prisoners. 40 feet below the howling chaos, Mara Lindqvist was mending a sock. A single lantern cast its warm, amber light across the main chamber. The small cast-iron stove held a quiet, steady fire, and on it a pot of stew sent its steam and its smell of herbs and slow-cooked root vegetables into the still, warm air. The temperature in her home was 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It had been 65 degrees when she woke up. It would be 65 degrees when she went to sleep. The air was fresh, not stale, not damp. The gentle, constant breathing of her convective system moved clean air through her home in a current too soft to feel on the skin, but present nonetheless, a quiet, invisible river. There were no drafts. There was no roaring sound. There was no desperate competition between fire and cold playing out across her floor. There was only the hiss of the small fire, the simmer of the pot, and the rhythmic click of her needle, and the silence. The silence. She could not hear the white hurricane. Not a whisper of it. Not a suggestion. The 10 yards of solid earth above her head absorbed every decibel of the storm's fury the way a hand closes over a flame, completely, absolutely, without remainder. The most powerful blizzard in the recorded history of the Dakota Territory was an abstraction, a story happening somewhere above her, in a world that felt, from 40 feet down, impossibly remote. She ate her stew. She read a few pages of the small book of Danish poetry she kept in the cedar chest, the last birthday gift Jonas had given her, his handwriting on the inside cover and ink slightly smudged, as if written in haste or emotion. She slept beneath a single wool blanket, warm and still and at rest. She was not just surviving. She was living, and the storm raged on above her for 3 more days. The white hurricane battering the surface world with everything it had, tearing at the log walls of redemption's finest homes, killing livestock and testing courage, and stripping away every comfortable assumption that the town's people held about their mastery of this land. And Mara Lindqvist slept. 3 days. She slept through a killing blizzard like a seed resting safe in the ground. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. And what Edmund Voss found when he came to check on the woman he had called a fool is something I need you to see for yourself. Hold on. We're almost there. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. Not slowly, not with a gradual diminuendo. It simply stopped. Between one moment and the next, the world went from a roaring, churning chaos of white fury to a silence so total and complete that it felt like a different kind of assault. Like the storm had been pressing against the eardrums for so long that the absence of it left a ringing. The sun rose on a landscape that had been transformed into something alien and clean and heartbreaking in its beauty. The entire world was white and still. Deep, sculpted drifts curved around every obstacle with the graceful geometry of wind made solid. Trees wore their impossible white weight in silence. The sky above was a cold, perfect blue. Redemption dug itself out slowly. And as the people of the town emerged, blinking into the brilliant white morning, the toll of the white hurricane became clear. Several families on the edge of town had abandoned their homes during the storm and tried to reach the town center through the white hurricane. Some had not made it. Others had survived only through the intervention of neighbors who had risked themselves to search. Every family had a story. Every story contained a moment of pure terror, a moment when the fire had flickered and the cold had leaned in close, and someone had looked at someone they loved and thought, "Is this it? Is this the end of us?" Edmund Voss stood on his porch in the bitter morning cold and surveyed the wreckage of his assumptions. His wood pile was nearly gone. He had lost 2 of his best horses. His house, his masterpiece, stood intact, and he was grateful, fiercely and humbly grateful, for the safety of his family. But he could still see the frost on his interior walls. He could still feel the way the cold had been inside with them, a silent, uninvited guest that all the fire in the world had only partly displaced. Everything he had built, everything he had been certain about. He stood on his porch, and he looked out toward the far edge of town, toward the property everyone called the widow's Folly, and he felt a single, nagging, impossible thought work its way into his mind like a splinter. What if she had survived? Not out of care. He was not proud of this. There was more than care in the thought. There was the beginning of something else. The beginning of a question that a man of his certainty rarely allows himself to ask. What if I was wrong? He bundled himself in his heaviest coat, pulled on his boots, and began the arduous work of wading through waist-deep drifts toward her property. It took him nearly an hour to cover the half-mile. The cold was a crystalline, breathtaking thing in the aftermath of the storm, still vicious but clean now, without the weapon of the wind. He arrived at her property expecting to find either silence or disaster. The shack was a ruin, as expected. Its boards had finally lost their argument with the wind. It had half collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and the force of the storm's sustained assault. He looked at it and felt nothing, because it had been a ruin before the storm, and its collapse was no surprise to anyone. The mound of excavated earth was a smooth, curved white hill, indistinguishable in form from the natural drifts around it. Voss walked toward the well, preparing himself. He had been a builder for 30 years. He had a practical man's relationship with death and disaster. He was prepared to find nothing good. And then he saw it, a detail so small and so impossible that it stopped him where he stood, mid-stride, one boot lifted in the act of taking a step that he did not take. On the far hillock, sticking up from a snowdrift like the neck of a buried bottle, was a thin, stone-lined pipe. He had never noticed it before. He had not known it was there. From that pipe, a thin, almost invisible thread of smoke rose straight up into the still, frozen air. Smoke. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant warmth. Warmth meant life. He stood in the snow, staring at that thread of smoke, and something that had been a very rigid, very certain part of him began, quietly and without any dramatic announcement, to come apart. He stumbled forward through the drifts to the wellhead. The entrance was buried under a deep drift on 3 sides, but the center was clear, a shaft of relative darkness dropping down into the earth. He leaned over the edge and peered down. He could see nothing but the faint, warm, amber glow of lantern light far below. "Mistress Lindqvist," he called. The cold took his voice and scattered it. "Mara." A pause, long enough for him to wonder, long enough for the fear to return, the fear that this too was nothing, that the smoke was some strange trick of geology, that the warmth rising from the shaft was the warmth of a dead fire, that he had come all this way through the white aftermath of the worst storm he had ever survived to find. "Yes, Mr. Voss." Her voice came up from the dark, easy and unhurried and calm, the way a voice sounds when it comes from a person sitting comfortably in a warm room, in no particular hurry to be anywhere. He was so stunned he could not speak. He heard the sound of a ladder, the creak of a boot on a wooden rung. Then her head appeared at the rim of the shaft, then her shoulders, then the rest of her, climbing out into the blinding white morning with the easy movements of a person who has slept well and eaten and is simply going about her day. She wore a simple wool dress, a light shawl around her shoulders. No heavy coat, no fur, no desperate layering of every garment she owned. Her cheeks were pink. Her eyes were clear. She was not shivering. She was not gaunt with fear or hollowed by cold or trembling with the specific relief of a person who has barely survived something. She looked comfortable, and as she stepped fully out of the shaft, a cloud of warm air billowed out behind her, visible as breath in the brutal cold, rolling up into the frozen morning like the exhalation of a living creature, like the warm sigh of something large and quiet and deeply, fundamentally at peace. Edmund Voss, master builder, the most respected man in the territory, stood in the snow with his half-frozen hands and his almost empty woodpile and the memory of his daughter's frightened face, and he looked at this woman he had called a fool, this woman whose plans he had dismissed as madness and grief, this woman who had spent the worst winter in living memory 40 feet underground, in a home she had built with her own hands and a shovel, warm and fed and at rest. He felt the warmth on his face, a gentle, impossible wave of it, radiating from the dark mouth of the well shaft, from the earth itself. Warm. The earth was warm. In the depths of January, in the aftermath of a killing blizzard, the earth was warm. Everything he knew collapsed quietly, like snow falling from a branch. His eyes were wet. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried since he was a boy. But there was something about standing in 40 below wind chill, feeling the warmth of a woman's wisdom on your face after 3 days of genuine terror. Something about that particular juxtaposition that did something to the inside of his chest that he could not fully contain. He took an unsteady step forward, then another. He looked down into the shaft. He looked back at her face. He looked at his hands. "How?" he said. The word came out with the cloud of his breath, a small white surrender into the cold air. One word, 3 letters, a lifetime of certainty, offered up. Mara looked at him. She looked at this man who had called her grief-mad, who had called her work a folly, who had ridden out in September with the weight of the entire town's verdict behind him, and told her she was digging her own grave. She looked at him standing in the snow with his wet eyes and his humility and his cold hands. She felt nothing like triumph, nothing like vindication. She felt, if she was honest, a kind of tenderness, because she recognized what she was seeing. She had seen it before, in herself. The moment when what you were certain of falls away and leaves you with only the bare, necessary question. She saw a neighbor who was cold. "Come down," she said simply. "I have stew." And Edmund Voss, who had never in his adult life been a student, who had never been in a room without knowing more than everyone else in it, who had built his entire identity on the foundation of being the man who knew, followed Mara Lindqvist down the ladder, descending from the harsh, bright world of everything he had failed to understand into the soft, warm dark of what she had known all along. The moment his boots touched the floor of her home, he stopped. The air, not just warm, enveloping, steady. The warmth of something that has been warm for a long time and intends to remain warm, the warmth not of fire fighting cold, but of deep earth simply being what it is. And the floor beneath his boots, the packed earth floor, was subtly, miraculously, gently warm, like a hand pressed warmly against the sole of his foot, like the earth itself offering something up. He placed his hand on the wall. Cool stone, not the life-leeching cold of his own frosted interior walls. The neutral, living temperature of the deep earth, steady as a pulse. He sat down on the bench she offered. She ladled stew into a bowl and put it in his hands. He held it for a moment without eating, just feeling the warmth of it move through his cold fingers, watching the steam rise in the lamplight, breathing the smell of herbs and slow-cooked meat and warm stone. Then he ate. He ate in the silence of her home and the warmth of the deep earth, and the hot food moved through him, and the warmth moved through him, and something in his chest that had been armored against doubt for 30 years began, quietly and without drama, to simply let go. When the bowl was empty, he set it down and looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked around at the chamber, at the elegant arch of the ceiling, at the small stove with its clever flue descending into the warm floor, at the fresh air moving gently through the room without being felt as a draft, at the lantern casting its steady light on walls that held no frost, no ice, no evidence of any struggle against the cold whatsoever. "Show me," he said. His voice was different than it had been in September, different than it had ever been, perhaps, in the presence of someone he had underestimated. "Show me the principles." And so she did, without pride, without condescension, without a single note of the satisfaction she might have been forgiven for feeling. Mara Lindqvist explained it all, the thermal mass of the earth and how it worked as a battery, the convective loop of the ventilation system, the hot smoke flue that turned her floor into a radiant heater. She used the practical, quiet language Jonas had given her, the language of someone who had listened to the deep earth and understood what it was saying. Edmund Voss listened. He listened the way he had not listened in a very long time, with his whole attention, with the openness of a person who has been shown, in the most undeniable possible way, that what they did not know was more important than what they did. When he climbed back out of the well an hour later, he was a changed man. Not outwardly, not yet. On the outside, he was still Edmund Voss, large and solid and deliberate, moving through the snow with the careful steps of a man making his way through changed terrain. But on the inside, in the place where his certainty had lived, there was now a different kind of knowing. Humbler, quieter, more spacious. He did not just see a hole in the ground. He saw the future. And it began the moment he walked back into town and said, to the first man he met at the mercantile, "I was wrong, and I need you to come and see why." Word moved through redemption with the speed of any story that contains a surprise ending. The pillar of the community, the ultimate skeptic, had been to the widow's home and come back humbled, had seen something he could not explain with the tools he had eaten her stew and listened to her speak and came back saying, she was right. One by one they came, 2 by 2 and in small groups, still wrapped in their surviving the blizzard coats. They came to her property and descended the ladder. They came with their skepticism worn thin by 3 days of genuine terror. Their certainty about how things must be done scraped raw by the white hurricane. They descended into Mara's home, and they felt the warmth and breathed the clean air and stood in the quiet. And one by one, they came back up changed. The mockery dissolved. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and completely, the way ice dissolves in spring, not breaking dramatically, but simply becoming water. Their pity turned to something else entirely. Their condescension turned to awe. The widow's folly became Mara's method. And then simply, the method. That summer, no one in Redemption built a log cabin. They dug. With Edmund Voss as her foreman and her most eager student, Mara oversaw the building of a new Redemption. Homes cut into hillsides, using the principles of earth sheltering she had taught. Ventilation shafts on higher ground. Subfloor flues. Thermal mass. The physics of deep earth applied with growing confidence to the practical business of survival. They called them dugouts, but they were not the damp, miserable hovels of desperate poverty. They were warm, dry, efficient, and alive. They were homes that worked with the earth instead of against it, that used the planet's own patient warmth instead of fighting a losing battle against its cold. And Mara taught it all, freely, holding nothing back. She had no bitterness to give. She had spent it, if she ever had it, in the quiet of that claustrophobic tunnel, pressing her cheek to the cool stone and saying Jonas's name into the dark. She had come through to the other side of something, and on the other side was this, the warm, real, daily work of being the person who knew something the people around her needed. She was no longer the widow, no longer the foreigner, no longer the liability, the folly, the mole woman. She was the founder. She had given them more than warmth. She had given them a new way to see. She had taught them, at the cost of one terrible winter and one woman's extraordinary refusal to give up, that the greatest resources are often hidden below the surface of what we think we know. She had taught them to listen to the whisper. Tell me in the comments, has anyone ever called your dream a folly? Has anyone ever looked at the thing you were building and told you it was a grave? Share your story below, because you're not alone. You have never been alone. There are people all over this world, right now, digging their tunnels in the dark, pressing their cheeks to the cold stone, whispering the names of people they have loved and lost, and keeping going. If that is you, if that has ever been you, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Mara lived the rest of her days in her quiet home, 40 feet below the Dakota Hills. A community she had saved came to her for wisdom, for warmth in winter, for the particular steadiness of someone who has been tested at depth and found unbreakable. A journal was found among her things many years after she was gone. Most of it was practical, measurements and calculations, notes on geology and ventilation, careful records of temperature at different depths across different seasons. The handwriting of an engineer. The handwriting of a scientist. The handwriting of a woman who had never been given any formal credentials for what she knew but had known it anyway. On the last page, in a different hand, neater and slower, as if written with care, as if she had known it would be read. The surface shouts, but the deep earth whispers. A wise soul learns to listen to the whisper. The well that Jonas had dug, the dry well, the failed gamble, the monument to a man who had come to a new land with hope in his hands and been silenced by it. It had not been a grave. It had been a doorway. Mara Lindqvist had walked through it, 40 feet down into the belly of the Dakota rock, carrying a lantern and a shovel and the voice of a man she loved, and she had built a life in the quiet heart of the earth that the surface world could not touch. She had been warm. She had been home. The surface shouts, but somewhere below the noise of everything that everyone says must be true, below the confident voices of people who have never questioned their own assumptions, below the mockery and the pity and the verdict already reached before you finish speaking, there's a deep, steady warmth. Start clearing the entrance. Start listening to the whisper.